in 1961, that Playa Girón, that historic defeat, the first defeat of U.S. imperialism, was defeated because of that same tradition that started in 1957-58. That is the rebel army coming out of the people as part of the people, leading that defensive and the offensive to actually defeat the mercenaries. Now, at that time, people, only a few months before or 1 year before, the Cuban people did not even have a militia. Fidel explained that only a short period before, we didn't have any militia. Most people, workers, peasants, did not know how to use a gun, how to train, how to march. But in a very short period of time, foreseeing what was going to happen, in 1961 in Playa Girón, the Cuban revolutionary leadership started to form the militia. Now, my direct experience of that is a bit indirect, because when I was writing my first book in 1997-98, spending a lot of time with my Cuban colleagues in Havana, I asked them about that whole experience of 1961, or the period leading up to 1961, and they told me very proudly that one person, I was asked to join militia. He said that was the proudest moment of my life. He never handled a rifle. He didn't know how to use it, but they learned how to do it. And of course, this, you can multiply that thousands of times, where the people, because of the leadership, were able to establish themselves as the armed militia in the case of any attack. And in fact, that is what happened. When the Playa Girón attack took place, the militia was already organized in order to counterattack the people. Now, I think the counterattack, the U.S. aggression against Cuba, I think it's important once again to point out there's a lot of talk about democracy and all that, whether Cuba's a democracy or whatever. I think Cuba, using the example of the Playa Girón civic military union based on its origins in the Sierra Maestra in 1957, 1958, is an outstanding example of protagonist democracy, not just participation, but people actually being their own leaders, the authors of their own revolution, that is protagonists in the future of the revolution. And that is what happened in 1961. In addition to the actual physical arms, it was this consciousness in the minds of the people that they are defending their own revolution with their own rifles, with their own arms against the United States. That is what defeated the United States. They were not able to establish a beachhead, and the inevitable took place when they were defeated. Now, I think it's important to point out, I think one of the main features of what I call this protagonistic democracy is the relationship of Fidel and the masses. I think it's a quite unique situation which we don't see very often. And there's for example, after 1959, there was several meetings took place, mass meetings took place in 1959, 1960, 1961 between Fidel and the people in huge rallies, thousands of people. And in those meetings, Fidel raised the issue, should we have elections now? And he openly said, well, look, people actually booed down the suggestion, not booing down Fidel, but rejected the suggestion that we should have elections now. Why? Not because the Cuban people are anti-democratic, they didn't want elections, but the only experience that the people had with regards to elections at that time was what is taking place before 1959. Under the US-backed Batista regime, you had this fraudulent elections. They would change from one party to the other. As one party became discredited, they would put forward another party. This is not what the people wanted. I remember once on a street corner, I will never forget that time, also around 1997, 1998, I asked a couple of people that I know directly or indirectly, what would you say if the United States wants to bring that type of democracy to Cuba? I said, they will do it over my dead body. We will never accept the US model of democracy. They had their own experience with it. Now, in that period, the people in conjunction with Fidel said, we will have elections later on. Now, it's important to point out, like, the relationship of Fidel and the mat. When I wrote about this specific events in 1959, 1960, 1961, with regards to the Fidel as the leader and the masses of the people taking a common position against elections at that time. By the way, they were against elections at that time because the people and the leadership did not want to undermine the advances that were taking place at that time. That is land reform, literacy, nationalization, cultural changes, economic reforms. That was their main thing on the agenda at that time. And the elections at that time would have just diverted the attention of the people to what was going on at that time. And elections actually only took place in 1976.